the Western media, whether it's CNN or the BBC or Fox News or anything else, their depiction of Iran is always a caricature. Again, very similar to what we have in Venezuela, from what I've been seeing on the BBC and the CNN and other media outlets. It's very different from what I'm seeing in Caracas. One interesting thing was that during the riots that we had a couple of years ago, the Persian media based in London was inviting people, guests, who were saying, yes, killing the police. One lady said that it's a holy thing to do, to kill police officers. And they killed 70 or 80 police officers in Iran. But the Western media was, saying that the police in Iran were killing people. But the number of police officers that were killed during that period were huge. And by the way, the same was true in Venezuela during the unrest a few years ago. A large number of police officers were killed through very violent riots in this city, in Caracas. So you see the same sort of themes. You see very strong parallels in. They're not identical, but as I said, when you look at the violence towards police in Iran and the violence that existed towards police, I don't know if anything like this has happened today. I haven't heard of police being attacked or anything like that, but I'm talking about the unrest that we had a few years ago in Venezuela. Disproportionately a large number of police officers were targeted and killed. So it's very complicated. They use sanctions. They use their allies, countries, Western countries, and their client regimes to put pressure on governments. They did that towards Iran, and they do the same. They've been always doing the same towards Venezuela. So, as I said, there are striking similarities. I think there are differences too, but it'll take too much of the time of your audience to go any further. I think that's I guess enough for now.
That was very, very helpful and very insightful.
And by the way, I should add that the Arabic media in the region, which is controlled by oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf and other dictatorships, mostly client regimes, they do the same thing, but towards Iranians. They're hostile towards Shia. They fabricate stories about Shia or about they're very hostile towards Persians, very racist. Often they make claims about Shia ideology that are completely untrue and unfounded and fabricated, and they try to create hatred towards Iranians and towards the Shia. And then in the Persian language, and these are controlled, as I said, mostly by these Arab dictatorships, many of them oil-rich. And then the Persian media, which is controlled by the West, by Israel, and some of these Arab dictatorships, although the Arab dictatorships have sort of, I think, backed off of this particular industry for now, because they want some sort of rapprochement with Iran. The Persian media based in the West, they are hostile towards Arabs. So it's very interesting that the West and its allies, they tell the Iranians that the Arabs are your enemies, and then they tell the Arabs that the Iranians are your enemies, and that sort of thing. So that's how it works, basically.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, not to go too much in depth into U.S. politics, but of course, the conservatives and Republicans are always seen as very strident against Iran. But you also have a very important aspect of U.S. politics, which is the liberal voices that are used often, in my view, to create consent for intervention ultimately. And actually, recently we had one of our kind of prominent liberal politicians, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, again harp on this idea of the, quote, morality police in Iran and the limitation of freedoms for women specifically. And so I wonder if you had any thoughts or reflections about how this liberal segment of U.S. politics is used to create consent for intervention and propagate a lot of these false narratives that we hear about Iran.
Well, again, the Western media, whether it's CNN or the BBC or Fox News or anything else, their depiction of Iran is always a caricature. Again, very similar to what we have in Venezuela, from what I've been seeing on the BBC and the CNN and other media outlets, it's very different from what I'm seeing in Caracas. And people who travel to Iran are always very shocked that it's so different from what they've heard. And that's because Western media narratives are so irrational and hostile. And of course, they use particular narratives for political purposes. In Iran, women, they dress as they like. They, people can look on YouTube or wherever. But there are certain norms in Iran, which and they're based upon an ideology. It's based upon the Islamic ideology, that women should not be commodified, objectified, sexualized, and so on. But they wear different dresses, different colors. Some are more conservative. Some are their clothing is more revealing, or it's not as if if they're women, they're all the same way. But what Iran considers to be pornography, what Iran considers decent exposure, is different from Western standards. And of course, there's a debate in Iran about what should be where the law should stand on all this. It's not as if there's no debate in Iran. There's always debate in Iran. If you sit in a taxi in Iran, or if you go and use the metro, or if you sit in a bus, Iranians are always talking politics. They're cursing. You'll hear people cursing the government or the state or religion, or it's very normal in Iran. It's been like that ever since I was a teenager. Ever since I was politically aware, that's always, before the revolution, no, people did not talk politics. But after the revolution, people do talk politics. And it's very different from, the sort of the picture of Iran in the West. However, the West is, regardless of what someone may think about dress, indecent exposure, or what they think that the law should be, the West is not sincere about women in Iran or children in Iran, because first of all, the sanctions are directed against women and children. They are directly against the most vulnerable people in society. The people who are more vulnerable are the ones who are hurt the most. The working class, those who have smaller salaries, and of course, children and girls are among the most vulnerable. So they don't care about women. And then when we look at Gaza, for example, they're fine with this Holocaust. They have no problem with the daily massacre. We wake up in the morning, women and children are being massacred. We go to bed at night, they're being massacred. We wake up again tomorrow, it's the same thing. So Western media, Western politicians, Western elites, Western diplomats, none of them have any concern for Palestinian women and children. So obviously, that is all nonsense. And I think that now people, and what is interesting is that in Iran, many of my former students who were actually protesting on the streets in Iran a couple of years ago, or some of them even rioting, they now have a different view of the world than they did a couple of years ago, because they were listening to the Western media say how bad and evil Iran was, and they were young and naive, and they didn't know much about their own history. Some of them were in high school, some of them just entered university. The university students often think that they know everything, undergraduates the first couple of years, and then gradually they become more mature. And that's why most of those who are like in the protests were undergraduate students rather than graduate students. But in any case, many of them over the last 9-10 months, their politics have evolved. They see the United States for what it is. They see Europe for what it is. They see that they're behind the genocide. They're supporting the genocide. They're funding the genocide. They're arming this army of genocide. So maybe some of them, or many of them, have not, turned and become hardcore supporters of the revolution, but they are no longer supportive of Western governments or Western narratives, or they no longer believe Western narratives. So things have changed a lot in Iran, I think. And I think the same is true across the global South. So right now, one thing that I have seen is that Iran has become much more popular in circles. And I've seen that here in Venezuela with a lot of people who've been coming in from the observers who've come from across Asia and Africa and Latin America. I do see that when I speak to people, that Iran has become much more popular today because they see what the West is doing in Gaza, and they see what Iran and its allies are doing in defense of Gaza. So a lot has changed, and largely thanks, or no thanks, I don't know, to the despicable policies of Western regimes in West Asia and in Gaza and Palestine in particular.
Well, I kind of want to segue into Palestine because Palestine wasn't forgotten at all during yesterday's celebrations. I want to show a few clips here.